Hi, everyone. Welcome to Scientist and the Resurrection webinar. My name is Sierra Reyes-Tan, and I'll be moderating us today. Bless you. I'm a scientist teaching biology at Lipscomb University, and I'm also an editor for Peaceful Science blog. Our event today is sponsored by Peaceful Science blog, which is a blog dedicated to creatively and compassionately exploring special topics at the intersection of faith and science. We do have co-sponsors today, and I would like to acknowledge them. That includes the InterVarsity Emerging Scholars Network and Grad Resources. Both of these organizations provide helpful resources to people all along their academic journeys, from undergrads to graduate students, postdocs, or even early career scientists. So if you fall into any of those categories, I encourage you to follow them on social media to learn more. But we are grateful for their support today. Before I begin, I would also like to acknowledge Joshua Swamidas in the audience, who is the founder of Peaceful Science, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to lead this. So the topic for our webinar today centers around the question of what do scientists think about the resurrection? And joining us today, we have a panel of about 4 scientists in STEM backgrounds, ranging from physics to computational biology and chemical engineering. And they are ready to share with us why they believe Jesus rose from the dead. So 2 of our panelists, Dr. Walsh and Daniel, have already written posts for Peaceful Science, so I'd encourage you to check those out after the webinar today on the resurrection. And then the other 2 of our panelists, Dr. Carlson and Dr. Galloway, will be having posts featured at a later time, so keep an eye out for those. But welcome to all of our panelists. Would you mind briefly introducing yourself to our audience, just stating your name, your university, your discipline or area of research, and then lastly, how you celebrated Easter this past Easter, since Easter is, after all, a celebration of the resurrection. And also, I'm sure this was an Easter unlike any other for you guys. So we'll start with Katie.
Hi, I'm Katie Galloway, and I'm an assistant professor at MIT in the Department of Chemical Engineering. My work focuses on building biological systems, specifically to control cellular decision-making. So my family, I have 4 kids between the ages of 10 and 2. And so we celebrated Easter watching a story of the resurrection via the most recent relaunch of Superbook, which they love, and just going through the story from the Bible and then the TV that kind of synergizes. And then we did kind of a traditional egg hunt, and that was Easter for us.
Thank you. And Andy, would you like to start next?
Sure. So I'm Andy Walsh. I'm the Chief Science Officer at Health Monitoring, a public health software company. So we try to help public health departments get access to electronic healthcare data, who's using healthcare and where and why, and how to make sense of that data so that they can understand what's going on in terms of public health in their jurisdictions. My background in biology and academia is in the biology of infectious diseases, which for the past 20 years has been a real conversation killer until about a couple months ago, when all of a sudden everybody wants to hear what I have to say about these things, which has been an interesting experience. I also write for InterVarsity and the Emerging Scholars Network about science and faith every Wednesday. You can see a blog post there, and I have a book, Faith Across the Multiverse, about science and faith questions and using the language of science to talk about what I believe in terms of Christianity and the Bible. And in terms of Easter, we live stream church service in the morning, had a little bit of impromptu makeshift communion at home with my wife and my 2 kids. And then we had a video chat with my wife's family. We had folks from Iowa and Western Pennsylvania, here where I live, all on a 4-way video chat to try to have some family time.
Thank you. Erica?
Hi, my name is Erica Carlson. I'm a professor of physics at Purdue University. I am a theorist, so I use math and I use computer coding in order to study what electrons do inside of quantum materials, which is really fun. In fact, I really, really like quantum mechanics so much that I recently put out a popular level video series on it with the great courses, Understanding the Quantum World. For Easter, well, okay, we're in a slightly unique situation. I'm on sabbatical right now, away from Purdue in Paris, and we live in a kind of tiny apartment for us. You know, it's okay for Paris size, but for an American, it's a little small. So we had to be creative with Easter. We watched, we tuned into our local church here over the internet, which is Hillsong Paris. We've very much enjoyed connecting with them, and then we had a little Easter egg hunt in the apartment without eggs, but with the candy that we could order on the internet that arrived, you know, before Easter. We have 3 kids, by the way, ages 13, 10, and 6.
Thank you for sharing. And Daniel?
Hi, I'm Daniel Ang. I'm a physics PhD student at Harvard. I work in the field of experimental atomic physics. In particular, in my experiment that I'm working on, we use experimental atomic physics techniques to measure fundamental physics quantities. In my case, it's the electron electric dipole moment, which is basically how spherical or symmetric the charge of an electron is. And that's a really interesting quantity to measure because it can tell us something potentially about larger cosmic level questions, like why there's more matter than antimatter. So I've had this sort of passion for looking for new physics with tabletop experiments since I was an undergrad. And I'm glad to be able to continue it at Harvard. And besides science, I also have a longstanding passion about thinking about issues related to science and faith. I've been a Christian for most of my life, but I've also been wrestling with what it means to be to have science and also to have theology. And so I've written some articles for Peaceful Science, and I also participate in the forum there, talking about these issues. And for Easter, yeah, well, we've been stuck in quarantine basically here in Cambridge for the last few weeks. So we've our church has just met online, and this last Easter I actually had the privilege of leading worship for my church, Trinity Cambridge Church. It was not easy because like it had to be live streamed, and so I was just like actually at this very spot just singing and leading songs, and I just love celebrating the resurrection through music. I think music has always been a big part of my life as well. So yeah.
Thank you all for sharing. It's great to meet all of you. I also share some of your resurrection experiences this past Easter, my makeshift communion. But I'm glad to meet all of you. Thanks for joining us. Just to give our audience a heads up for the format today, I'll be starting off with questions to our panelists to begin our conversation, and then that will be followed by a Q&A from.
The resurrection connects more with like me as a human rather than me as a scientist. So I'm going to what Paul says about the resurrection in 1 Corinthians 15. The resurrection gives us hope that we can overcome death someday. And even as scientists, no matter how much success or wealth or fame as scientists we get, one day we're going to die. This is like the big problem big issue that all humans in history have faced, and a lot of religions and philosophies seek to give us the answer to that. And for Christianity, death is viewed as a consequence of our sins, like all the brokenness and violence in the world. Death is a reminder of what the punishment for that is. And so we're stuck with that. And the resurrection, however, gives us this hope that there's at least one man in history who did overcome death, and that was Jesus Christ. So as a scientist, you can call it sort of like a proof of principle. In science, usually when somebody proposes like a new experimental approach to testing something, then you would usually try to at least prove that it works, even in a rough way. And that's sort of how I think we can view the resurrection. Like it just gives us a proof that this kind of thing can happen. Jesus Christ is a prototype for how we will someday be resurrected altogether. And of course, he's not just a rough prototype. The difference is that he's like the most perfect example of something like that could happen. So the resurrection gives me this hope that one day I'll be able to be resurrected, and also that I'll be able to have fellowship with my Creator. And going back as a scientist, so I view my work as a scientist in two ways. The first thing is that, of course, I view it as a calling that God has given me right now here. Like right now, my mission as a graduate student in physics is to work on this experiment. I feel God has directed me to do that. And so one day I'll be able to meet with God as someone who's putting me to my calling right now. The second thing is I view my work as a scientist as studying God's creations, creations in nature, seeing these beautiful structures that he has created. In a way, I'm doing theology because I'm studying the artist by the means of his works. And the resurrection gives me hope that one day I'll actually be able to meet with the artist himself instead of just seeing it like indirectly. As again, Paul says in the same letter, 1 Corinthians, but in chapter 13, right now we see through a mirror, dimly, right? But then we'll see face to face. So right now I'm, studying, looking for the electric dipole moment, how round an electron is. People have been looking for that for 70 years. But, God knows the answer to that. And it's been, and the resurrection gives me hope that I can have a personal relationship with God. And also that one day, I can fellowship with God and he will tell me what the electron electric dipole moment is if I haven't known by then. So that gives me a really incredible hope.
Great.
Thank you. I know Katie has shared something similar about the resurrection meaning being connected to hope. Could you talk a little bit about what the resurrection means to you, Katie?
Yeah, so I think I really appreciate the intellectual anchoring in the historical evidence there is for the resurrection, and that to me is something that's really important. I think in terms of as a scientist, I want to see that there's evidence. I want to know that my hope is real and bounded in reality. That this is a transcendent event in which God reached down to us and provided the hope that as Daniel was pointing to, that Jesus is a prototype, that he's the first to rise, and so too we have this hope. And when I was younger, I grew up as a Christian, and I think we kind of take this as a face value that, our hope is in Christ. But what is it? I think it was really only when I started considering, well, what's the alternative? Like, if there is no resurrection, what is my hope? And in grad school, I remember there was a time I was working really hard and had sort of just fallen asleep exhausted after months of work, and woke up in a place where I felt very disconnected from everything, and so much so I woke up in my own room, but not knowing where I was, not knowing what time it was, not knowing how old I was, like really disoriented from how tired. And out of that, I remember there was this feeling of, what does it all mean? Why am I even here? Why does any of this have any meaning? And it was weird because it was just such a crushing feeling. It wasn't comforting at all to be able to think about this unbounded from reality. And then eventually I kind of recalled where I was. I looked around a little bit. I could see things, and I was like, oh, I'm in my room. My baby's in the other room. My husband's with me, etc. And I sort of was like, oh, I have meaning because of all these things. But as I reflected later on, I was like, well, actually, the real meaning comes because of a relationship with Jesus Christ, a connection to something that is going to transcend time and death. Eventually, all of us will cease to exist. In fact, the universe, as far as we can tell, and maybe Eric could talk about this, is eventually going to heat death. So all of these AI concepts we have where we could upload our consciousness and live forever, those are still also only going to be temporary. So all of our attempts to escape from death are not going to work unless there's something that can transcend our reality. And to me, that is the hope of the resurrection, that you have a person who's reached down and said, even if all of this physical world fades away, there's something beyond it. And to me, that's the great hope.
Thank you for sharing, Katie. Being that you are all scientists or come from a STEM background, I think it's important to ask the question about what type of evidence is there for the resurrection, or what evidence do you base your belief in the resurrection on? And so as scientists, we're trained to look for evidence. And we do that using standardized and reproducible methodology, whether that's the scientific method, working in a lab, repeating experiments a certain number of times, doing statistics and seeing if there's some level of significance, and then venturing into trying to explain or interpret what that data means. So I'm wondering, is scientific inquiry even possible into something like the resurrection? I know Daniel mentioned it's a prototype. It's a one-time event that happened. Is a resurrection even a scientific question? And then what type of evidence have you personally found for faith in that? And I think I might start us off with Andy here, because in his Peaceful Science article, he wrote about specifically scientific inquiry into the resurrection and the types of questions he has found himself asking as a scientist about it.
Yeah, thanks. So, the resurrection, on one hand, raises a lot of questions that we can phrase in scientific terms and that we could imagine exploring through scientific testing, right? So, what were the biochemical processes that were going on, after Jesus died and then after he was in a resurrected body? Was that the same physical body? Was it made of the same physical matter? Did it have the same genome? Did it have the same microbiome? There's all these kinds of biological questions, biochemical questions, even physics questions. Was there energy involved? Where does that energy come from? All those kinds of things. So we can certainly ask those questions in the language of science, and we can imagine that if we had access to Jesus, pre and post resurrection, that we could do experiments to test those questions and answer some of them. But we don't have access to that. We don't have time travel. We don't have any sort of physical evidence. And so, unfortunately, we have to leave a lot of those questions as unresolved, at least for the time being. And so, while I think there's maybe even some fun to be had in hypothesizing and speculating about some of these things, and at least framing the questions, it's not going to be a fruitful direction to try to test those kinds of questions scientifically. It's more of a matter of history, and there are certainly historical methods that overlap with scientific methods, but in terms of what we can do in the laboratory, it's not it's not an area for fruitful scientific investigation. And maybe somebody else can speak to more of the historical evidence in more detail.
Yeah, I was wondering, Daniel, I know for you in your Peaceful Science article, you mentioned that the historical evidence is one of the strengths for you about the resurrection. Could you talk a little bit about that for our audience?
Right. So one thing first is that I'm not really a historian, right? I'm a scientist. But however, I think my scientific background gives me sort of an obligation, I think, to kind of just examine the historical evidence, at least at an amateur level and a reasonable level, to see if it just checks out. And I do recognize the difficulties in completely ascertaining if this happened. But as I wrote in my article, there are I would say 3 planks of evidence that I think even a neutral, non-Christian person might consider reasonable. The 3 planks is first that most historians believe, virtual all historians believe, that Jesus lived and died by crucifixion. And that's the first fact, and I think nobody seriously contests that. The second one is that Jesus was buried, and then his tomb was found empty. Now this fact is, I think, slightly more disputed, but I think there are still good arguments to argue that to support that the empty tomb was real and the burial was real as well. The third fact is also again indisputable. The disciples of Jesus, after his death, claimed and genuinely felt that they had experiences of Jesus, the risen Jesus, afterwards. And so you have to kind of explain, especially the latter 2 pieces of evidence, what is explanation for the empty tomb and what is explanation for these resurrection appearances. And I think there's this interesting confluence of events. You don't even need to think at this point about the other things that the gospel described Jesus did. I mean, you might be skeptical of those, but these 2 facts are sort of attested to by basically all multiple sources. If you consider the Gospels and Acts and and some other biblical parts as independent sources, and we just treating them as historical documents, you don't have to treat them as like infallible documents, you'll have to face this issue. And so there are multiple hypotheses that can describe this. And so you might argue that there could be a hypothesis of, say, hallucinations, collective group hallucinations for the case of the post-resurrection appearances. And that's improbable, although it's possible. And there are arguments to, and we can go into detail if we want about, you know, how it's reasonable though that hypothesis is. But even if you explain that as that, then you also have to explain, like, why was the tomb empty? Like, if somebody like took the body, who was it, and what motivation would they have, and why couldn't somebody just, you know, go to the tomb and check for themselves and that kind of thing. So I accept that, like, I don't think like there's like a really airtight proof of Jesus' resurrection in this case. Like, you can always say, oh, like maybe this just something really improbable happened. Like, there's two different improbable hypotheses just came together. And, you know, I think somebody could just say that and just leave the evidence. But I think for me, at least with the tools we have, tools of ancient history, which are limited, we have, I think, a state of evidence that is consistent with Jesus being resurrected, or at least something really odd happened there, like something improbable, odd happened there. And I think for me, that's sort of like enough to make the claim of Jesus' resurrection just check out at a basic reasonable level. And so in my article, I mentioned that the resurrection is a litmus test of Christianity. And what I meant by that is that not that the resurrection, if it is reasonable, proves that and the entirety of Christianity is true necessarily, but at least it shows that Christianity, in claiming to be a faith that is anchored to historical events, namely the life and works of Jesus, at least this central event, the resurrection, does seem to be borne out by historical evidence. And that for me is compelling. As a amateur armchair historian, influenced by my scientific background looking at these things.
Thanks for sharing. Daniel.
Yeah, sure. I wanted to add one more thing, which is the fact that science isn't independent of this chain of evidence. So, for example, the scientific method supports some of the pieces that are the evidence itself. So, for example, if you have an ancient document and you're trying to figure out, well, when was this ancient document written? I mean, we don't have, if you're talking about text that actually made it into the biblical canon, we don't have originals, we have copies, but, however, when you have a piece of physical evidence that is that text, whether it's a copy or not, you can, science can support the dating of that document. People have multiple methods of dating those things. You can look at the type of ink, you can look at the type of material, you can look at the style, you can look at the writing itself and the words themselves and how they're formed. But you can also, this would be my favorite method, you can take just a tiny sample, just a little bit, maybe from the back where no one will notice, and put it in a mass spectrometer and use physics methods of radiometric dating, which is where we detect the ratio of certain atomic isotopes in that sample. And that can give you a very good estimate of the age of that document. And we can use similar methods to help date archaeological artifacts. The exact method depends on exactly what physical object you're trying to trace. And another way that the scientific method directly can play in and actually supports this line of evidence is one of the competing theories that was put forth for maybe Jesus didn't rise from the dead. Maybe, when he was crucified, he somehow only passed out and then they laid him in a tomb and he just woke up and walked away. But there's been people working in the medical sciences who have contributed to, analyzing, well, what is recorded about what actually happened to Jesus, and basically shown from based on that set of facts, he wouldn't have lived. I mean, there's many things in there that say that he wouldn't have lived. He was tortured so badly before the crucifixion, he would have died anyway. Crucifixion definitely kills you. And the Romans who did it are very good at this thing. It's kind of their job is to make sure it worked. And so there's ways like that in which the scientific method is called in kind of as a supporter to the physical evidence itself.
Thanks for sharing, Erica. Next question I had for all of you is about your specific disciplines. I know at least two of you are in the domain of physics. We have a chemical engineer and then a computational biologist. But from your specific backgrounds, do you find that you approach questions like the resurrection in any unique ways, or are asking unique questions, kind of like the ones that Andy was asking about the cells that made up Christ's body? Were those different from the ones in his pre-crucifixion body, from his post-resurrection body? Do you find that you think about this question or questions like that differently than other scientists, either in your own discipline or outside of your own?
For me, I haven't really thought about what a chemical engineer, how we evaluate the evidence. Again, I think that there's so many things that we'd like to test that Andy brought up, but they're completely beyond anything we could examine. And also, I guess to kind of go to the evidence part of this, I'll just give you like kind of a story. I remember when I was finishing my Ph.D. or trying to, my mom was like, well, I'm just going to pray that there's going to be a miracle. There's going to be a miracle in your experiments. And I was like, no. I need this to be reproducible over time. And I was like, we don't want any miracles, Mom. The miracle will be that I understand it. The miracle will be I know what to do. That's the miracle. Not that the experiment works one time. In some ways, that's the worst experiment you could ever have, because you spend your rest of your life chasing that one experiment. And so in some ways, I think of the resurrection, and my approach there is, we're not looking to extract scientific principles from what we view as a miracle, which is, in this case, a counteraction of all the things that we know about what happens to people after they die. They don't come back to life. There isn't a 3 days later, someone's, had water pouring out of their side and been ruled dead, buried, and then wakes up again. That is a violation of the laws. That is a miracle. And it's not something we would build a scientific theory out of. We would say that this is a suspension of the normal rules of what's going on. And so we want to look at that claim very seriously. And so I think that that's one reason why there are people oftentimes who are, I think, scientists, they don't know what to do with the resurrection. They're like, I can't study this the same way. This isn't part of my domain. The laws of what we understand to define life have been violated here. And so it either can't be true or I don't know what to do with it. And so I think that's actually a lot of the reason why scientists have a difficult time interacting with the resurrection. They don't come from a place of faith to begin with. So that's one thing that I kind of think about, I guess, my scientific discipline. I was like, I don't really want miracles in my experiments. I want principles that can be reproduced. But again, I think that's one of the reasons why it's hard for people to interact with the resurrection. So that's kind of how I think about it and approach it from my discipline.
And that Daniel, in his Peaceful Science article, you described the precise measurements that are required in your line of research when it comes to measuring the shape of an electron. And as part of that, you described it as being no stone needs to be left unturned, no hypothesis left unquestioned. And when you're approaching your science with that level of rigor, how do you, as a scientist, do you bring that to questions like the resurrection or your faith? And at what point do you stop, or and there's something more than just that scientific level of rigor?
I think well, that is an interesting question, but I think, like, as a scientist, like, one thing that has taught me is that, like, these kind of issues, like, expert expertise is like really valuable. So from the beginning, I kind of just like accepted that I can't, like, I have to defer to some historians who've studied this way more than me, and whatever personal conclusions I make might not be convincing to like a skeptical historian who might know the evidence much more deeply than me. But I do have, I think, like, a peculiar way of looking at it. And so, like, yes, like the resurrection is a miracle, right, if it happened, and so it's a one-time event. In that sense, it's not usually subjected to science. On the other hand, though, like in physics, we do have like examples of one-time events that we studied. Like, for example, the Big Bang just happened once, and we can study that not by like trying to replicate it per se, but we try to look at it by looking at the after effects of what would have happened, like what we would see if it happened, and in this case, a cosmic microwave background. and like, there's also the theory that a really big asteroid crashed on Earth and that caused the extinction of dinosaurs, right? And that's now a serious theory because people can look for what it looked like if that actually happened. The resurrection is a bit difficult because in theory you could study it that way, but we don't really like it. It's a miraculous event, but it's also very localized. Like it's not like Jesus like body resurrected in a huge explosion or something. It was just like something that some disciples saw, but it did have after effects, and the after effects are the texts that the disciples left and other people, and so we can somewhat analyze that in light of and trying to see like if that event had happened, like what kind of text would we expect, or what kind of textual evidence would we expect, and that goes again back to what Sierra was talking about, precision measurement. Yeah, like in my discipline, we measure things very precisely. But for that precise measurement to have any credibility, you need to really talk about the uncertainties in your measurement. You need to talk about the statistics of your measurement, which is just like the random noise that can come into your measurement just because of how imprecise the tools you have are. But you can also talk about the systematic effects, like if there are any biases, either from the experimenter, or from the system, the design experiment itself, which so that like something which you can measure something that looks like, in my case, an electron-electric dipole moment, but actually is another effect masquerading as such. So applying it to the case of resurrection, I think one thing I realized after reading a lot about these is that there's just so much uncertainty about ancient history. Like we just have a few documents, and in the case of Jesus, like we actually have a lot, many more documents, like compared to a lot of other ancient events. Like we have like the 4 Gospels, we have stuff like the ancient creed and 1 Corinthians 15. We have stuff from Acts and a few scattered extra biblical sources. So we already have like a few sources, which is more than usual, but that's still sort of like really rough compared to the precision that like a physicist would expect in regular life. So in this case, I think affirming the uncertainty and like the wriggle room, I think is just an outcome of me like being a precision measurement person. I think like I know that like this is not like we can't determine this 100% for sure. But at the same time, I think I've done my best to kind of try to determine what would it look like if it happened. And I think at this point, if the resurrection really did happen, I think the evidence would look very similar to what we have it today. And so that's how I kind of, from my personal scientific assessment, view this resurrection as a well-supported event.
And Eric, I know in your upcoming Peaceful Science article, you mentioned that as a theoretical physicist, you value the bottom line, and you bring that same logic to your approach in the resurrection. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. And in addition, I wanted to add a little bit to the idea we've already talked about of this being a supernatural event. I think it might be helpful if you're a skeptic to perhaps think of how to learn how I, as a Christian and as a scientist, think about the supernatural at all. That can be a real showstopper for people. What do you mean by supernatural? I think it's helpful to think of the fact that if we do have a creator, it's helpful to remember that he's in charge, not us. We do have in the teachings of Christianity, we have the idea, it's in Genesis 1, that when God created people, he put us in charge of the planet. He says so. He says it to Adam and Eve, hey, take care of this place, okay? Go and fill the earth, multiply, subdue it. And he also gives specific instructions to take care of the garden that he made for them. I believe that by extension, when God put people in charge of his creation here, he gave us authority. I'm extending beyond the Bible now, but I believe he gave us authority to uncover physical laws. So that means that I have authority when I go into a lab, I can test things and I can find out how this universe actually works, okay? Now, there's the question then, do I have the same authority to experiment on spiritual phenomena? No, right? I mean, as soon as you bring in spiritual phenomena, you're talking about personalities, you're talking about God, you're talking about his angels. You know, it's hard enough to get clearance to do experiments on humans, to get them to sign all of your consent forms. You're never going to get, you know, such a consent form signed by angels. So we just don't have the same authority level. And, you know, one of the things but we can make observations, right? We can make observations. We just don't get to run controlled experiments for sure. But one of the things that, you know, my atheist colleagues sometimes ask me is, if I admit the supernatural, then I can't get any lab work done. How do I know God's not just flicking answers all the time? And this goes back to what Dr. Galloway mentioned in her PhD, that did she want a miracle to happen? Actually, no, we wanted something to be just natural processes when you're making measurements. To me, that goes back to, again, the idea that the supernatural is not a force that's just, I can write an equation about, rather it's a personality, it's God and his angels. And so it would be unethical of God to have, you know, to step into your laboratory and flick things around and give you false answers. So that's how I kind of frame it myself. As I frame it as an issue of authority, and also to simply keep in mind that we are not in control of that aspect. We can only make observations. Now back to Chiara's specific question. I do, as a theoretical physicist, I prize, how do I get from logical point A to logical point B in as few steps as possible? That's sort of considered an elegance test. If you can prove something in 50 lines, but you could prove it in a different way in 3 lines, I want the 3-line proof. So Daniel has already mentioned the basic historical facts that people look at in pointing to the resurrection, the fact that Jesus really did live and die by crucifixion, the fact that his earliest followers were reporting very early on that they had experiences of his resurrection after the death, and the multiple attestations that his tomb was found empty. That last fact, by the way, is perhaps the least well supported by the data. There's data for it, but there's less. And I will be writing an upcoming article for Peaceful Science about this, but there's a long list of extra biblical sources that one can point to that affirm most of these pieces, and they're you know, no one of these sources is going to give the entire thing, but to give you a flavor, pieces that will, you know, that historians cite include you know, Clement of Rome, Irenaeus, Tertullian, Polycarp, Eusebius, Ignatius, Origen, I'm probably mispronouncing these names, Dionysius of Corinth, Josephus, Hegesippus, no idea how to pronounce that, Clement of Alexandria, Justin Martyr, Tacitus, Lucian of Samosata, and Marabar Serapion. I apologize for all of the mispronunciations, but none of those names are writers of things that make it into the canon of the Bible. So Christians aren't just looking at things, you know, ancient documents that later got canonized and we put the label Bible on them. There are also things that are completely outside that set of material that also attest to the same set of facts.
Thank you. We have time for one more question before we jump into the audience questions. So the last question that I have for you guys is based off of what we've been talking about already about limitations to science when it comes to approaching the resurrection, although we can use our scientific background to inform how we think about it, as you just mentioned from your background. But Dr. Swamidas has written about these limitations of science when it comes to questions like the resurrection, saying, but what can science say about the resurrection? What can science say about God? What can science say of the darkness in this world? What can science say of our destiny? No experiment can guide us here. Science is silent on these most important questions. All my scientific training is meaningless. Do you agree with him? Why or why not? And if science can only take us so far when it comes to the resurrection, what else do you find yourself leaning on, whether that be personal experiences, encounters, or some level of faith outside of your discipline? And let's see, I could ask Andy to start. I know in your Peaceful Science article, at least one thing that was new to me was you referenced Hank Pym, infinite game theory, about this continual journey of could you explain that and how it relates to the resurrection?
Sure. So Hank Pym is a fictional scientist from the world of Marvel Comics. He's played in the movies by Michael Douglas. in a somewhat different characterization. But anyway, in the comics, there was a comic series called Avengers AI, and Hank Pym was exploring concepts of artificial intelligence and games and different things. And he describes his idea of an infinite game, a game where the goal is not to win, where the goal is to keep playing, to find a way to keep the game going. And that in itself is a difficult challenge. And I think that's an interesting way of sort of framing how we think about both our experiences here in this life and what we're looking forward to because of the hope of the resurrection and because of the hope of that new creation, is this possibility of keeping the game going. That the goal is not to be better than anybody else at a certain thing, or I'm not competing with you or you're not competing with me, but we're trying to work together to build something that can keep going. How do we build a thing that can last for an extended period of time? How do we build communities, relationships, civilizations in such a way that people can participate over time, over multiple generations? And I think that's an interesting challenge here in the here and now. And I think that is a good practice for what we can look forward to in the world to come.
That's a really interesting thought in light of what we're all doing that feels so unsustainable in this pandemic. I don't know if in light of like, oh, just the goal is to keep everything going. And I'm like, oh, it's the game I'm playing too at home with my kids while trying to also work. And so that's a very interesting reflection, Andy. I'm curious, do they come up with any solutions?
No, nor would I trust any that came from a 6-issue comic book miniseries.
So what else do any of the other panelists find yourself leaning on outside of the limitations of science?
Erica has already kind of talked about like the limitations of testing the supernatural, and I completely agree with that. But I think one thing which sometimes like we kind of just assume as a given is sort of that science is like, we can't like look for God in science. And well, I think that's true in an experimental, like particular sense. I think the regularity of nature that makes us able to do science in the first place is really a pointer to God, at least for me. I think that's actually like the thing which anchors my belief the most. Like the more order I see, the more intelligible reality is, and then the more I think inescapable is the conclusion that like there has to be some one source that is itself or himself like ordered and rational in order for this all to make sense. And so I think if you start out with that way, then I think it's actually a better frame of mind understanding how you can still feel the presence of God in every single scientific thing you do. And in a sense, like it's sort of different because compared to if you're running an experiment to test if God exists, for example. Because I think when you run an experiment, you design an experiment, there's always like the assumption that the outcome could be yes or no. So like the thing you're testing for is in a sense, it's contingent. It's not necessarily exists. It could exist, it could not. Like this particle could exist, it could not. But I think that's sort of like a limitation on how we should view God. I think like God, if he exists, is a necessary being. Like he's the source of this all. He's not just like a character in the game. He's like the game designer, and you might even say he's the one who runs and provides sustenance for the computer to run this whole game. And it's like, as I guess, going back on what Erica said, like, it's not only conceptually and categorically incorrect, I think, to test God. It's also, I think, scientifically difficult or impossible because you don't have access to change the variables to your liking. You can't ask God to move there or do this or do that. It's really hard to control for all these variables. So I think the main method to just going back, like the main thing that sustains me is just like that wonderful beauty and the fact that we can continue to have success in science. It's an outworking of that creation in the image of God in Genesis that was also mentioned. Like it's that sort of gift.
Did any of you?
I wanted to add one thing to be wary of here is the trap of scientism. Scientism is the idea that the only valid form of knowledge is knowledge that is gained through the scientific method. And I think, certainly as scientists, we're a little bit perhaps biased and favor our own field a little bit. And it can be, tempting to think that the only real knowledge that counts is knowledge that was gained by the scientific method. When you say it out loud like that only scientific knowledge is meaningful, the whole thing just falls apart, because the next question you ask, or the next question your philosopher friends ask, is, oh, really? How do you know that? Did you use the scientific method to decide that only scientific knowledge is meaningful? And of course you did. It was an unscientific statement to begin with. So it's helpful to remember there are forms of knowledge that are outside the branch of science. It doesn't make them less meaningful. It doesn't make them less important. It means that you use different tools to get that knowledge. So for example, if you wanted to know whether 1 + 1 is 2, you're actually not talking about an evidence-based methodology anymore. You're talking about a mathematical proof. You will go talk to your math teacher or your math professor about how to do that one and prove that 1 + 1 is 2, or something more exciting. If you wanted to find out, for example, if my husband never proposed to me, you wouldn't apply the scientific method to find that out. In fact, that's not how I found out. You use different methods for different things that you're trying to understand. So I think that's extremely important to keep in mind as well. There are, the whole branch of epistemology in philosophy can help guide you as to how to think about how rigorous certain lines are. But scientists do not hold a corner on the truth. There's plenty of truth that we all believe that we did not derive by the scientific method. We derived it by other methods. I also want to bring out the very Christian idea to echo what Daniel said. Can we test God with a scientific method, or can we not? I want to make clear, though, some Christian teachings about what God says about testing things. And how do I say that? What I mean is we look at what's written in the Bible, and we have some guidance there as to how the Lord thinks about that. We find him saying things like, taste and see that the Lord is good. It's an invitation to do what he says and see how it goes. There's a time when God is telling the nation of Israel, you haven't been tithing, you haven't been giving to the temple the money you're supposed to give to upkeep the temple. And he says, test me on this and see if I won't open the floodgates of heaven and bless your nation when you first give the money that you're supposed to give for the support of the temple, the tithes. We also have a New Testament teaching that to test everything, hold on to the good. So there is this idea in which God invites us to test. And if you look even at Jesus' method of public discourse, it's lovely on so many accounts. But one of the things that Jesus did was he taught publicly, and he invited and welcomed public question and answer and exchange. So he himself, by the way he taught, invited inquiry, question asking, and answer seeking, and testing ideas like that is something that God really invites, favors, and enjoys. He's not afraid of our questions.
Thank you, Erica. That's a great segue to our question answers time for our audience to have that invitation and opportunity to ask questions for you all. I really appreciate you guys sharing and answering the questions that I had. I've learned a lot myself during this webinar. So I'll start with a couple questions I've seen in our chat here. Some of them are a lot of them actually are based off of the evidence component that we discussed earlier, lines of historical evidence. One of those questions is about the 4 gospel accounts on the resurrection, and wondering, given the importance of the resurrection towards Christianity, how do you reconcile differences within those resurrection accounts in different gospels? If you've thought about that, or any thoughts on those for our panelists.
So I was just chatting with my kids kind of about this and how there's different gospels, like what do we understand about that? Why would they be the same or different? And why would they have different parts in either one? And I mean, I even asking them to recount what happened in a day, they never describe the same events, especially if they're talking about who hit who. But, mostly in terms of, oh, we did this, and then maybe someone will forget about one part, or really highlight that the only thing that really happened was they got an Easter egg or something like that. That's the chief event, in which there's an entire 20-minute story where somebody else covers the whole part. And none of them are excluding anything to try and obfuscate most of the time. They're simply recounting the parts that are the most important. And so that's kind of how I talk to them, at least, about how we think about the Gospels, is they were each addressing different people. And so they were trying to then emphasize the parts both that they remembered and thought were important for the groups that they were talking to. And I actually find that the fact that they aren't entirely synergized to be very compelling. I don't know if you guys have seen the types of things that come across Twitter or Facebook, when like it's extremely word for word reproductions of very similar text talking about some sort of political issue or social issue, and it just looks like a bot, basically. Is like spewing the exact same thing, and everyone's copy and pasted it a bunch of different times. You're like, oh, this feels so authentic and grassroots, and I really feel like I got your fresh take on it. But that's essentially what I think you're seeing also with the Gospels. The fact that they aren't the exact same party line of, this is the story of the day, tell it exactly this way, is to me actually an authenticating factor in terms of like they were writing it in a different way to a different group of people, and yet the amount of synergy across those differences and different people they're writing to is enormous. Even trying to do that with experiments sometimes when you go to write things down is a challenge when you're like, wait, you did this and this and this and this, and we all have the same basic story of how things work is challenging when you have multiple events across many years. And so the fact that they're so synergistic but while distinct is, to me, an authenticating factor. So that's my thought.
Did any of the other panelists want to chime in on that question from our audience?
I think what's also remarkable is that the synergistic elements some of them are just stuff which is less likely to be made up. Like, for example, like all the sources agree, the four Gospels agree that women were the first to see the empty tomb, and like, sure, there's debate on how many women went there, but they're all kind of like the same. Like, it was just women and not like the more prominent male disciples like Peter coming there first. And that's like, like back then, the testimony of a woman wasn't very highly regarded. And so if somebody wanted to make up like, some witnesses so that other people could be convinced, they would probably invent like somebody authoritative like Peter to be the first one to see it and stuff like that. But they didn't, in fact, but they put Mary Magdalene and some of the other women. And so that to me is like a marker of like some of like how the synergy also seems to work out. Also, the other thing is sometimes like when people ask like, why aren't they more consistent with rather than what we have? I think it's really hard to set an objective standard on how consistent is consistent, because if they're like super consistent, then you would have somebody else saying like, oh, they're just copying from each other, and we don't really have four independent sources. Like, and often in these debates, I just don't really see people like consistently having like a one criteria that can answer like how much consistency should we expect. Like, it's hard to really measure. And then the third point I wanted to make is like, yeah, even if say for the sake of argument, I'll accept that there are some inconsistencies. Like, you don't need to regard the Gospels as like infallible documents to prove like the historicity of the empty tomb, for example. In fact, some historians like they only need to look not even at the Gospels, but at the material from 1 Corinthians 15 verses 3-7, where there's like this ancient creed testifying that Jesus died, was buried, and was seen after his death by multiple eyewitnesses. And even skeptical scholars agree that specific creed that Paul inserted there, like, that's not from Paul. That's an ancient creed that probably dates to within a few years or a decade of the events that happened. And so, like, with that alone, that you have to explain all these appearances. And there's like a great article I cited in my Peaceful Science article that argues that even though Paul doesn't explicitly mention the empty tomb there, the way he talks about being buried and Jesus being resurrected, that presupposes an empty tomb. Like, it wouldn't make sense in the cultural context of the time to think that Jesus rose again, but his body was still in the tomb. So like that, even just that single document is sort of like you have to explain how that came about. And some people feel that document itself is sufficient to be historical evidence of resurrection. So, yeah.
Yeah, I like everything that Daniel has just said here. It's been a while since I dug deeply into the harmony of the Gospels on this. It is actually very fascinating to get all four of them out at the same time and look through who says what, and it is interesting the differences, the different ways that they explain the stuff. You know, it's worth remembering too that Matthew, Mark, and Luke are not completely independent. There's so much overlap between them that people debate whether one was first and the other two used that one as a source, or whether there's some fourth source that was prior that they all copied from, or some combination. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke are interdependent sources, something like that. John's pretty different. You know, and some of them mention different women's names, not the same women's names. Okay, that's not a contradiction. It's just this one listed some women, this one listed some, you know, an overlapping but slightly different set of women. One, you know, lists one angel, one lists two angels. Well, if there's two angels, is there also one angel? You know, every time I looked at something to see if there was a contradiction, I couldn't find a firm contradiction if you were willing to sit there and just go through them all. But perhaps keep in mind the big question, right? If the big question you're asking is, was Jesus raised from the dead? You can set aside the Gospels and you will still have plenty of data to look at. So for example, from, you know, for the case of, you know, was Jesus crucified? You could even set aside the entire Bible and you'll still have 4 extra biblical sources that point to his crucifixion and another extra biblical source that points to his death. So a lot of these things, there are so many attestations of it. Don't get lost in the harmony of the Gospels. I mean, Christians have written lots and lots and lots about that. And you don't need, you know, that's actually almost veering into a different question, which is the question that my faith got hung up on as a young person, which is the inerrancy of Scripture. That's a different issue. What the Christian faith rests on is the resurrection of Jesus. You know, most Christians eventually come to something like inerrancy of Scripture, or at least a very high view of Scripture, but you don't have to hold that in order to ask the question, did Jesus really rise from the dead? And I think these questions about the harmony of the Gospels are more of a question of the inerrancy of Scripture than really sticking hard to the evidence of, did Jesus rise from the dead?
Thanks, Erica. I'd like to encourage our audience to submit any more questions that you have in our chat. Right now, I do have a couple more, and then we'll probably start to wrap up. But one of our audience members asked about, do you know of any scientists who are trying to test God or test the supernatural using the scientific method? I don't know of any offhand, but I'm not sure if our panelists have any insight on that question.
Okay, so I saw this pop up in response to what I said about the supernatural, and then it was later the question asker said, oh, I was asking that rhetorically. It's okay, we're not afraid of your questions, and I'm grinning because I actually have a colleague who tried to test God. Okay, he's a seeker, he's not a believer, he's still a seeker, but he tried to put God, you know, to the test, and he came up with a little prayer test, and his prayer test didn't work, and so, you know, this wasn't the sort of thing where he was, you know, applying the scientific method rigorously in a way that he would publish, but he was, as a very science-minded person, he wanted to test the ideas, which I very much respect. I think one of the things that we have to keep in mind when we do that is, first of all, remember that God likes for you to interact with him. You know, one of the Christian claims is that you are supernatural and that God has given you supernatural senses. When Jesus would talk about certain people being blind spiritually, right? I mean, there were people he encountered who were physically blind, and he often healed them miraculously, supernaturally, but he also talked about a general blindness of certain people and he wasn't talking about their physical eyes, he was referring to their spiritual capacity. And so he is telling us there that we have spiritual capacity, and in a sense, you need God's help to have your eyes opened, but you still have that spiritual capacity. So I like to also keep in mind that, again, if you're talking about trying to test in some way as God there, just keep in mind he's God and we're not, right? Commands go from him to me, not the other way around. So I don't get to tell him what to do. On the other hand, you know, if you are interested in getting your hands dirty and testing this thing, I can propose to you kind of a test you might try. And I encourage you to try this and let me know how it goes. pick one of the Gospels. That's Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. These are the biographies of Jesus. Pick one of them. Read one chapter a day. Okay, don't get ahead. Just read one chapter. Take you about 5 or 10 minutes. Anybody can do it. And then try a prayer experiment. You know, God says that you have spiritual capacity and you can interact with him. So after you read this one chapter at a time, ask God. You don't even have to believe in him, right? That's the whole point. You don't believe in him. Just be honest. Say, look, God, I don't even know if you're there. But if you are, what do you want to show me about what I just read? And then hardest part, be silent for 2 minutes and make note of anything that comes to mind. The next day, do the same thing. Read the next chapter. You know, you might say to God, I don't even know if you're there, but if you are, what do you want to show me about what I just read? And then be silent for 2 minutes and take note of what comes to mind. My prediction is that if you will work through one gospel that way, I recommend Luke, by the way, if you like science. Luke was a physician. He kind of speaks our language. My prediction is that you will have an encounter with a God who loves you if you'll try that, keeping in mind that we don't tell God what to do, but he wants to start a relationship with you, and he's more than happy for you to get started praying to him, even if you don't believe him.
Thanks for sharing that, Erica. I know even I, as a Christian and believer, struggle to be silent and listen as I read a daily devotional. So that is a challenge that is not uncommon. But thank you. The other question I'll ask before we start to close up is just about, since another question we had from our audience was about evidence, and it was specifically asking about why do you believe Jesus's body wasn't stolen from the tomb? But I'll broaden that question to ask, is there any other sources of evidence for your belief that your belief in the resurrection is rooted in that, other than what we've already talked about in our webinar today? And I'll leave that open for the panel.
I think Daniel really got to the thinking about, we talk about evidence for an event and something that happens, right? You know, the impact event of a asteroid hitting the Earth or the Big Bang. You're looking for the radiant effect of that. And to me, what people often call the radical transformation of the disciples is that effect. And not just that effect, but then the ripple that it expands through, that this movement that happened to a small group of people, a persecuted group of people, I mean, heavily persecuted underneath the Romans, heavily persecuted by the only people who would have been their support, which would have been a lot of people they had come from many of them were Jews who then became Christians and decided to change their day of the week of worship, which I think Andy has spoke about. This is another radiant effect. If you think about that in parallel to experiences we have now, all of these things that changed because of an event, I can think of something at least for 9/11, like, why do we all take off our shoes? Who would ever take off their shoes in public get on a plane? Isn't that the most disgusting thing? I find it so. And yet we do it. No one would spontaneously be like, oh, take off your shoes at the airport and just put them through. No, there had to be an event. What was that event? Oh, there was a shoe bomber and 9/11. And those two things are the reasons why we all take off our shoes. So in the same way, there was a transformation of the disciples who went from this group who was like, we're going to take over Rome and, overthrow. And instead they're spreading out, going beyond their ethnic group there in Jerusalem and spreading to the ends of the earth with the news of that Jesus has risen. And they all go to their deaths saying that this is true. If someone stole the body, it wasn't the disciples. I mean, they were true believers. 11 people seriously tortured and never saying, I just kidding, this is enough. Like, they clearly believed what they were saying, that Jesus was risen. And they went to their deaths believing that. That was really the most important thing, and dedicated their lives to doing that. So those ripples, those impact events that we observe, to me, are really compelling. And so we can't see the physical impact necessarily of that you would see with an asteroid, but we see the historical, sociological impacts. And to me, again, I think that actually Josh has written about this. Like, if Jesus is not risen, there's like 2,000 years worth of history that doesn't have any explanation. Like, Christendom doesn't make sense. And that's obviously been a kind of large force in the Western world. So anyway, to me, that's the thing we haven't talked about in terms of like the massive amount of history that's explained.
Yeah, and I'd like to add to that, like this has actually been turned by N.T. Wright in his book Christian Origins and the Resurrection, Son of God, into an actual like additional argument for the resurrection, in the sense that like the early disciples of Jesus were all Jewish, and usually like, you know, being crucified, if your Messiah is crucified, that's a really shameful punishment. Normally you wouldn't like, after such a shameful event, like then go on and just pretend that he was that he was resurrected and go on to spread that. That's like a very like uncharacteristic belief of that time. Like we have some examples of other Messiah type movements which just died out after their like leader got executed, or somebody like a relative of that leader would be, you know, anointed as the next Messiah to keep it on. But we don't have anything like that in the Christian movement. So that's like another example of like a very specific cultural example, not just in a general Christianity successful kind of thing, but like, you know, what made these like Jews just change their mind? Like, it's really hard to explain just out of the blue.
Thanks. And we are coming close to our 1 hour and 30-minute mark to end. So I just wanted to take this time to ask Josh if he had a question, if he wanted to share his question for our panelists. And I have one more question to follow that up with.
Yeah, thanks for letting me thanks for letting me ask my question. Yeah, we've had some interesting conversations with other scientists, including scientists that aren't Christians, and we've noticed that they tend to have like a pretty strong reaction to apologetics or proselytizing or trying to convince people they're true. At the same token, a lot of them have been very open and even encouraging of seeing scientists that they respect explain why they affirm the resurrection. And trying to put that together, I think they're making a distinction between apologetics or proselytizing on one hand and education or explanation on another. How are you guys thinking through that in terms of how to talk about these questions in a way that will be really understood by people who don't share your beliefs, and in particular scientists that don't share your beliefs?
Maybe as a way of offering it also a distinction between what apologetics is or what maybe I should say proselytizing versus explaining, because I kind of think apologetics is, when done well, just explaining. But on the other side, I mean, so I think the difference between explaining and proselytizing might be assuming that your answers are good enough for anybody else. And that's just very anti-scientific. I think that the evidence that convinces any scientist of any given position is often different than others. And so proselytizing may be saying, hey, these are the evidences I find, these are the experiences I've had, and you should accept them too. And the only conclusion you could come to is the one I've come to. And I don't think that just exists within Christianity. I see that everywhere. In fact, anybody on Facebook or Twitter probably has the same thing for whatever is their fan theory. It's like, this is the evidence, and if you don't believe it, it's probably just because you're not that intelligent. And I don't think we ever want to come and with that type of idea as Christians. I think we want to say we wrestled with this, and the things that have convinced us, I think across the range of people here, are different. The things that we find particularly compelling and the things we find problematic are different. And so it's not compelling to say, these are the answers, here you go, and I've solved it for you. No scientist will, I think, reasonably accept that, and it's not a particularly effective way. That may be what proselytizing has been ineffective, but I think the explanation, you know, giving people the opportunity to wade through ideas is actually the model that Jesus put forward. He was always asking questions, right? We were just talking about the Good Samaritan on Sunday with my kids, and the first thing was, you know, like the guy comes and asks him, what do I need to do to inherit life, eternal life? And Jesus turns around and is like, well, what does the scripture say? And so I think people have to discover the answers for themselves. They have to ask questions. They have to know what's there, but we have to also recognize owning your answers is the most important thing that we do as scientists or as people. I don't know. That's kind of my thoughts on that, but I don't know if other people. Does anyone agree with me, or what do you guys think?
So one model or some examples that I found helpful. So there's folks like Stuart Kaufman, who wrote a book, Reinventing the Sacred, and Sean Carroll, the physicist, not Sean Carroll, the developmental biologist, wrote a book whose name I'm blanking on at the moment. But both trying to do similar things, and there are other books in the same vein, trying to put forward a scientifically grounded humanist sort of worldview, but going beyond the question that, answering these sort of grander questions of what is the meaning of life, and how do we live together as people, and what should our end goals be, and so forth. And I found those books, even though they're not coming from a Christian perspective, or even anything that we might recognize as traditionally religious necessarily, I greatly appreciated these guys put forward how they look at the world, made a constructive picture, and a cohesive picture of how they approach the world, as opposed to just sort of critiquing the things that they don't believe in, and shared that as a way to both explore that as an option, explore their ideas as alternatives, and also just as a way to get to know these people as people, right? They're giving you a window into who they are as people, and helping you get to know them better. And so I think, that's not an unreasonable thing for any of us to do, is to say, here's who I am. If you would like to get to know me better, here's how I think about things. Here's the conclusions that I've come to. I found them helpful, and hopefully you will too. And if not, thanks for your time and giving it a chance. And please share with me, the same things from your perspective, what you find helpful, what you find compelling.
Did any other panelists want to chime in on that? The distinction between proselytism and education?
I think for me, this was just something that I had to think about when I was writing my article about resurrection for peaceful science. And I was thinking how, other people who are non-believers would react and read that article. And I think one distinction for me is to, as other people have said, to allow some sort of honest, uncertainty, and the fact that this might not convince you, but it definitely convinces me. And I think, scientists are definitely comfortable with uncertainty and just saying we don't know about something. And that doesn't necessarily rule out, having a belief that something can work. Almost every new research endeavor is you don't know if it's going to work, but you're going to try it anyway. And if you think it's promising, that you have some, evidence, a preliminary evidence, not definitive evidence that it can work, then, a lot of people have, stake their careers on such an approach. Look at LIGO, right? The gravitational wave detector. For decades, people didn't know if they were going to detect anything. But some people evidently had some faith that gravitational waves did exist, and at a level that we could detect them, and they did go on with that. And you could say that was a sort of faith, in a sense of in that project at least. And I think in the same way, when we present evidence for our faith, I think you can be honest about that there's no definitive out and out proof of all of these things, but I just see it as hopeful. I think there's a great value in this project of faith, of the resurrection of Jesus, and that there's already good really good preliminary evidence for that, and that's what I've chosen. And I think being honest about that, and instead of I guess as Katie said, instead of just trying to say, oh, everybody has to go to my research project or else, then I think that actually ironically might attract more people to inquire what is it about Christian faith. And the Christian faith is it's not a single there's not a single 12-step method you follow to get into it. Some people have become Christians through the resurrection, or some people have become Christians through reflecting on the purpose of life, as Andy was saying, or the existence of morality, and so on and so forth. But maybe just your personal journey might not be theirs, but maybe if you just share your personal journey honestly, they might look at Christianity and maybe become Christians through a different sphere. And in a way, it's more fruitful and more peaceful apologetics in a sense.
Thanks to all of our panelists and to our audience for submitting questions. We have about 5 minutes left, and so I just wanted to end by saying, I'll end with one more question, but I just wanted to acknowledge our co-sponsors again, ESN and Grad Resources. Thank you for supporting this webinar today. And I would also like to give in a plug. If you are a scientist coming from a science background and are interested in writing for the Peaceful Science blogs Resurrection series, or you would like to share your story of why you believe with the resurrection, feel free to submit that to us. The last question I have is for our panelists. It was inspired specifically by what I read from Erica and Katie's upcoming articles for Peaceful Science, mostly stating the historical integrity of the resurrection events are of paramount importance, especially today, and that was connecting that to the current, in the context of the current pandemic. And then the other writing was the resurrection gives me courage for today and hope for tomorrow. And so I was wondering if we could end our webinar today with an encouraging message for our audience of what the resurrection gives you hope for in times like these.
Well, I'll give Katie the last word, then I'll go first, and you can have the last word, Dr. Galloway. You know, one of the things that perhaps is a shocker to all of us right now is our extreme vulnerability, right? We, at least in the developed world, in the modern age, we have such long lifespans and such great health that we get very insulated from death, and we can forget that there's a hard boundary condition on all of our lives. We are all going to die eventually. None of us know exactly when or exactly from what, but we can state that we're all going to die eventually. And so the resurrection, if it's true, it changes how you think about that, right? If Jesus was raised from the dead, and if his message was that I came to help you find the way to do the same thing, then that changes everything. It gives me hope that that the end of my life here is not the end of my life forever. And it gives me hope that I can be, you know, reconciled to family members and loved ones who have died before me. And it gives me hope myself that there is greater meaning, greater purpose, even for humanity, even beyond the confines of this physical universe, that there will be a future, and that we have some great things to look forward to.
Yeah, I think that reflections on mortality can be very grim, especially if you feel like this is it, this is the end. I remember when I was a postdoc, I was talking with another postdoc, and we were thinking about eventually there's going to be an end. I don't even know how this conversation happened. It's not a normal thing to talk about in lab. But he's like, well, and he was trying to be a little bit funny. He said, you know, I'm not here for a long time. I'm here for a good time. And at that point I said, well, what about for the people who aren't here for a long time or for a good time? You know, what do we have to say for people who a lot of their experience is suffering, a lot of their experience is dark, and for a lot of people right now, that's truly a reality. And even now, I think in the United States, there's a lot of uncertainty, but historically and worldwide, that's actually a much more keen reality, which I think Erica is pointing to. But if you look at some of the most joyful Christians in the world, there are people who are not, I think, afflicted with wealth and with comfort. There are people who really do live out of the abundance of saying, like, the joy of the Lord is my strength. And for me, I feel like that's a constant challenge to remember that the provision and the things that I have, that God's going to give me all that I need. And also, I think that gives me a lot of freedom in terms of thinking about taking risks as a scientist, in terms of my work, in terms of telling people about being a Christian. It makes me think like that God's going to also help guide me through the times where there's uncertainty. And so that gives me a lot of confidence and courage. That is the part where I was talking about courage is I feel like there are a lot of risks. There's a lot of things that we could do unintentionally that could really mess up the future. And yet I feel like God encourages us to step out in faith and say, you know, I'm here, I'm guiding you. And that gives me a lot of courage, because I think on my own, it would be terrifying to think, oh, I could, you know, there's this butterfly effect that I could be initiating and everything blows up. Instead, I feel like God constrains constrains a lot of the disasters that I've created, and instead is blessing me in ways that I would never have expected. So that's the message of hope for me, and then also the message that goes beyond the grave, that it's not the end. That to me is really encouraging.
Thanks to all of our panelists again. Thanks to Erica and Katie for closing us up for our webinar today and providing or sharing their story of hope that the resurrection gives them. I've enjoyed just being a small part of this panel, and I hope that I know that our audience has as well. But I would like to say thanks again to our co-sponsors and all of our panelists, and thank you. We're going to end our recording now, but we'll keep some off the chart recording continuing, and I'm going to defer off to Joshua Swamidas.